Thanks for tuning in again to the Replatform podcast, sponsored by Ampliance and Clavio. You're listening to myself, James Gurd, and my co-host, Paul Rogers. How you doing, mate?
Yeah, getting there. Thank you. Yeah, another major issue which has impacted the quality of the podcast with the background as a result of my foot injury. But yeah, getting there.
I'm loving the fact that we are a specialist technology podcast, but you've been forced to hot wheel it to an old laptop that doesn't support branded backgrounds, which is very entertaining. So our technology is seamless today.
Exactly, yeah. It's a very indirect route of me injuring my foot and not being able to get to the office.
Oh, no, it's good, though, because there's always a tale to tell on these podcasts.
Yeah.
And look, thanks to everybody who's tuning back in again. And for those who join us for the first time, a warm welcome. We hope you enjoy the content. We'd love to get a like on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple, etc. So our topic today is multi-storefront for e-commerce. So we're coming at it from the point of view of not what do platforms offer, but how do you decide when to use multiple storefronts? How many storefronts do you need and why? Looking through some of the use cases we've come across client projects and what we've seen other people doing. And it kind of ties in with a few of the podcasts we've done over recent months with big vendors like Ecommerce and Shopify around their offerings. And the other reason for talking about this is this year, when e-commerce is having a hard year compared with previous years, growth isn't there for most retailers. Some are shrinking back, and cost of living is having a big impact as well. A lot of businesses have taken stock and looked at their storefronts and gone, do we really need all of these? They're costing time and effort to trade, to operate. They lead to cost impact in things like increased license, increased app fees, ongoing maintenance and support. And some big brands are pulling back and putting the business case forward to cull some of their international storefronts and consolidate. So that's really interesting to see. There was a glut a few years back where everyone went crazy and just launched like 10, 15, 20 storefronts. And I think people are starting to realise it's not necessarily sustainable. I know you've seen that, haven't you, Paul, with some clients and other businesses?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've seen this loads, and I think it's interesting how different it is when you're working across different platforms, but essentially a lot of the same principles apply. Like one of our clients is it's a big brand, small online direct consumer site on Magento. They've got 32 storefronts essentially, so a mix of stores and store views, and they put so much of their limited kind of e-commerce merchandising resource into managing that, and it's so disproportionate. And 75% of the revenue comes from one store, and then you've also, to be honest, like it's limited revenue anyway. It just doesn't make sense. It'd be much better investing in content or brand experience, etc. And then equally the same principle applies to a Shopify or a BigCommerce where you have completely independent stores. But yeah, I think there's often a pretty big overhead to managing those stores, and there's a lot of things you can put in place to reduce those overheads, but there's still going to be an overhead. And I guess it usually comes down to like the potential incremental value and the size of your team, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point here, because it's easy to spin up a storefront, but do you get the value from the effort to maintain it and the cost impact? I think sometimes people don't realise that license fees are predicated upon the number of storefronts, traffic, etc., number of orders through. There's lots of different permutations that impact on overall license fee, and storefronts is definitely one of them. So in this episode, what we're going to cover is, just quickly for those who are new to the terminology, what do we mean by multi-storefront for e-commerce? How the decision impacts operationally, use cases for just standalone single storefronts, for example, like multi-currency to cover all your different customer groups, use cases for multi-storefront and platform considerations, and then looking at a bit of a summary at the end of what's the decision tree, what are some of the questions you could ask yourself to help you make the right decision. So let's start with the definition. So by multi-storefront, what we're talking about is the ability to separately manage multiple channels or route to market for each of those storefronts. So this is the front end customer website, has a unique set of functional requirements. So it does more than just enable multiple currencies, for example. And it might be accessed via a different domain entirely, or a different URL path. So for example, mysite.com versus mysite.co.uk, or mysite.com/en versus /fr for France. And each of the storefronts can be configured independently, as well as, depending on the e-commerce platform, sharing global properties. For example, you might have a site in Asia that you need to connect to a different payment gateway. You might have different shipping carriers you need to plug in, depending on the location. So the point here we're talking about is storefronts that are unique, aren't just a replica of your master store. You're trying to trade them differently. You might need to connect to different apps, different service providers. I mean, even I've seen a use case where somebody's had multiple ERPs, and the effort and pain of integrating multiple ERPs into a single storefront and managing the order management flow of that was prohibitive. It was far cleaner to have a separate storefront and do that integration cleaner. And the other point I think is this can either be via a separate login for each storefront. So if I'm going into my France store, I have a separate login to my UK store, or through a central admin login through what platforms multi-storefront offerings nowadays, like Shopify, BigCommerce's, where you can switch your store views within your single login, which is a far simpler way to do the admin. So that's my definition. Like, Paul, what anything else you'd add in terms of defining what multi-storefront really means?
No, I think in the context of this episode, I think it's just essentially separate entities, isn't it? And I think we'll go into more detail on kind of why you might need that and what the impact might be. But yeah, it's just different stores for different purposes, or different kind of entities for different purposes.
Yeah, I think the entity point, can you elaborate on that? Because entity is quite an important one from a financial point of view.
Yeah, so I didn't actually mean it like that, but yeah, absolutely. So it might be that it's like, a completely different registered business. It's interesting how many variables there are around that with some of the platforms. Like with a few clients recently, I've been battling Shopify's commercial team trying to get different businesses or slightly different brands under the same Shopify Plus agreement. And it's interesting how the slightest thing can suddenly result in you paying double or quite a lot more for your license. But yeah, that's another one that could be important. And the other one is, which I know you've had before as well, is another big one is kind of bank accounts and payouts and the financial side of that as well.
Cool. So before we start talking about the use cases for single versus multiple, let's have a look at why this is important. This is an essential thing we want to get across is how does your storefront setup impact you operationally? So we're going to riff on a few things here. And depending on your platform and requirement, some considerations that we're going to talk about can be achieved using a single storefront and applying configuration rules. For example, an open source platform like Magento is very flexible. You can do things if you don't have like an advanced B2B audience and you've got very simple B2B requirements. You could use a consumer-facing website and simply have a customer group where the price changes to excluding VAT on a particular login and cover off the requirement. So sometimes you can achieve what multiple storefront is intended for in a single storefront with the right setup and configuration. But we're going to talk through these operational impacts because they're important considerations. My first one is front-end experience and whether or not you're happy to have a uniform set of templates for all visitors where their content can be personalized. For example, you might have a country toggle where you can switch from, say, UK to France, and then the banners change. So it's not a truly fully localized experience or site, but it's just some content personalization. They might have translated banners, for example, translated content blocks, which doesn't need multiple storefronts, can actually be done with the right CMS in a single storefront. And also when you don't need a completely custom user journey for a particular site. What's your take on it, Paul, in terms of the operational impact from the front end piece?
Yeah, so you just touched on a few things. I think, things like language packs can help to reduce the need in quite a lot of the different platforms for different or completely independent stores. We've had quite a lot of clients that have wanted completely independent themes for different sections of their site. And actually, I think historically there were a few platforms where that was really hard, but now again, it's getting a bit easier. I think the only other one would be on some of the core platforms, so looking at Shopify in particular, I do think it's still really hard to, and I wouldn't say it's usually a combination of a few of these points we're going to talk about, but it can be hard to kind of essentially deliver completely different content and factor in for loads of variables around, international customers or different types of customers with a single store. But it's hard because there are kind of so many variables around it.
Yeah, that leads me on to my next operational point, which is trading and how sophisticated your merchandising, or let's say advanced your merchandising needs are do you have global merchandising rules? And then do you have a like personalization capability based on the individual user that's done normally by a third-party specialist tool? Versus do you really tailor all merchandising rules to specific visitor groups and site versions? There can be times when actually trying to do everything on a single storefront can get quite confusing.
Yeah, I think this is a really important one. I think I'm going to slightly kind of dip into the next one as well, which is catalog. And I think this is one area where like the Salesforces and the Magentos do have a really good kind of offering where like you can have, you know, multiple storefronts which can inherit a default value, and then you can also have local values, kind of parent-child type relationship with content, visual merchandising, you know, aspects of managing the catalog, and it can make things a lot more efficient. But equally, I think with the SaaS, some of the SaaS platforms that don't currently have like a fully kind of mature multi-store offering, the reason I'm combining them is I think it's getting easier to, you know, have a platform that allows you to visual merchandise and have a few variables within logic to push a certain order of products within collections or categories across multiple stores. And then the same principle exists with a PIM for managing product data. And I think a lot of because obviously the big commerces and the Shopify's are attracting more and more, you know, massive brands that have these complexities that find these platforms appealing because they're a bit leaner and a bit more agile, I guess, and maybe a little bit more cost effective in places. And I think that those teams, some of them have internal teams, are very good at pulling things out of the platform and then using or building functionality or buying functionality to make that multi-store piece a bit more efficient.
Yeah, and I think on that product point, I mean, there's a few use cases where the product catalog has to be different in different markets. And trying to do that in a single storefront and adding logic that will dynamically change all of the catalog and pages based on either a customer source or a selector can actually be more hassle than it's worth, and having a separate storefront which enables you to do it very cleanly. And then, as you say, have logic of what version of the product goes into which of those storefronts. So a good one is like electrical goods, where you know the electrical ratings are different in UK to US, and you can't have the same SKU. Therefore, it's the same product but different SKUs and different component parts. And having that where that's all in the ERP, and you can just push the appropriate versions through the integration into the local storefront. So product's a good one to pull out. The next one I've got is shipping. Now, I find this an interesting one because you can use a third party and set up a Shipper HQ and do all of your shipping logic in there. For people with simple shipping options where there isn't much variance depending on the country, it's the same carriers, but it's just different costs and lead times. Again, you can argue that you could just do multi-currency in a single storefront. Where do you see shipping materially impacting the need to have additional storefronts?
Yeah, I think there's certain levels of shipping logic that can lead to you wanting to have, like, particularly again in maybe the SaaS platforms, lead you to have different stores, but it's quite rare. I haven't seen it too often, but it's more like it's things like when you get into the depths of like certain products not being able to be shipped to certain areas, or like certain carriers having certain restrictions around certain products, and you just have a lot, like multiple like big complexities working together. And I think I have seen that, but I think the average platform, particularly I guess Shopify, which has been very limited around anything to do with checkout and all of this kind of stuff, is getting better all the time in this area. And I think it's a lot less likely now to need to go into separate storefronts for this kind of, as a result of this kind of stuff, than it probably would have been 2 years ago. And like you say, something like Shipper HQ, like in the past when I've had projects that have had like hugely complex shipping logic, rather than try and kind of become an expert in that and, you know, really spend hours and hours like simplifying and then building something, I've just tried to pass it off to someone like a Shipper HQ, to be honest.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. You can have separate storefronts and set the shipping logic configuration separately, and that gives you an efficiency, but you don't necessarily have to have a separate storefront just because you have different shipping logic. I think that's a key distinction. How about taxation? Because again, you could set up some platforms have this flexibility. Like Magento's pretty strong at enabling you to set up country taxation rules. I know the SaaS platforms like BigCommerce and Shopify have got native integrations with Avalara to enable it, which is really strong for US sales tax specifically. So this whole area, what have you seen when people start to say, actually, do you know what, we have because I've got one use case where one country destination, everything's going to be sent delivery duty paid, and for other non-core markets it's duty unpaid, and they've decided to split that out into separate storefronts to have that as a simplistic thing. Do you see that as a use case, or do you see other areas more important from like tax and
I think again, most platforms getting a bit better at this, and the third party's getting a bit better because of Brexit in particular, but also like duties just becoming a bigger issue. So I think it's got better, but I like what you just said there, where you have separate kind of logic around duties. And the other one that I was going to talk, so you mentioned in here, so the other one is price. It's a combination of kind of pricing and taxing and taxation, and like how you handle VAT on the front end. So if you've got a single store, it's actually very challenging to make it work long term if you want to show someone a price based on where they're shipping without asking them where they're shipping. And even then, it's quite hard to build. So it can be done, but that's been a reason. And the other thing is there's been a few issues with Shopify Market since they released that's impacted some of those types of areas. That's also led to an additional store on some of the projects we've worked on. So I think that can impact things. And pricing is the other one. If you want to split out pricing, but based on variables that are particularly hard, basically. So yeah, that would be the other one. I would add in kind of alongside tax.
Yeah, I guess there's a bit of a theme emerging here, isn't there? Which is when the business requirements and operation, often the finance requirements from a data management point of view, mean that in order to do something in a single storefront, you would have to create a lot of bespoke and custom logic, which then increases the risk of failure. It also increases the manual effort to ensure that all of that analysis is done correctly and reconciliations are correct, and that it increases your support and maintenance. So I guess there's often a breaking point where you turn around and go, well, actually, that's going to cause us more issues than it benefits. And a separate storefront would simplify this, and we can avoid building all that custom logic.
It's usually a bit of a combination of a lot of these as well, I would say. So like if you've got certain stakeholders that are obsessed with growing into certain countries and they want the ability to trade the sites locally, and then you've also got like a finance stakeholder that wants the ability to pay out in a local currency, for example, and not have to worry about the FX fees and everything else. And then when you combine them together, it's a lot easier to justify the additional store. The other one that I've put here, which is a big factor quite often, is stock warehouse availability, that whole piece. So essentially handling multi-warehouse where you've got different levels of inventory based on where the user's shipping to, and that whole piece can be a bit of a nightmare. A lot of the platforms still don't allow for multi-warehouse. So for example, Shopify allows for multi-warehouse, and you can have a primary and a secondary, but what you can't do right now is assign a warehouse to a market. So things like that, and the same applies to BigCommerce, and there's other platforms out there that have got the same issue. Things like that can usually be a driver. The biggest two that I see, the biggest three things that make people and I don't know if I'm actually eating into the next point, but the biggest
but that's cool because this is the way these episodes go, isn't it? We flow around the topic. So
the three biggest reasons I see people introduce an additional store, one is trading and local kind of promotions, content, proposition, all of that stuff. And then the second one is finance. So primarily not being able to use a payment provider or the payout piece, and losing a lot of money on the FX fees by having to convert back into a base currency. And then the third one is the warehouse. So just being able to show the best availability to a user based on where they're most likely to be shipping to, and essentially being able to localize that whole piece.
What is Amplience? In a word, it's freedom. The freedom to build a digital experience as limitless as your vision. Create, preview, schedule, and manage all your content in one easy place. Find out more at amplience.com. Amplience. Experience freedom.
Yeah, exactly. I think the inventory one was what my number one, which is depending on how many countries you're shipping to, how many warehouses you have to reduce your local shipping costs, and also to reduce your customs hassle of having to ship across territories. A lot of people have moved. I know quite a few businesses have moved out of selling to the EU from the UK, but quite a few have done a consolidation piece where they've opened an EU warehouse to strip out some of the paperwork and admin and cost of it. And depending on how many you've got, and I've seen this on several businesses, it then makes more sense to go point to point. UK with a UK DC, the US has got a US DC, the EU countries have a central EU one, and having those stores separated rather than trying, because a lot of platforms, as you say, that people are on don't have that native ability. You'd have to find a custom solution around it, which just seems a lot of extra effort and risk for little reward when you can just set up separate storefronts. So yeah, definitely that one's important. And yeah, the other one I've got, because you've already talked about the currency and the FX rates. I've had that on 3 projects this year where people are just desperate to save FX fees because at the moment cost is going up across the board, especially with like supply chain, material costs. Anywhere where people can strip out a couple of percentage points is a massive benefit to keeping people financially healthy. The other one's legal. So I've a few businesses where they trade in markets, especially out in Asia, a place like Hong Kong, but it's through third party distributors or agents, and they are fully responsible for site management, and therefore to keep things clean, they're not logging in as the business. They need a separate storefront that can be self-contained. They may even use a different platform entirely. That's a different point. But I have seen those situations where you have like a local site to enable a third party to trade it, and they choose within certain boundaries how they manage that site.
Yeah, I was going to add that one at the end as well. So we've seen it a lot recently. I feel like there's a lot of trends going into next year. It's expected to be like a relatively bad year. And there's a lot of third parties, like you say, that will take, a brand and take them into Japan or South Korea, and they'll take a percentage of sale. And that seems to be quite an appealing thing for a lot of brands at the moment. And yeah, we've seen that a lot where people just wanting to quickly introduce a Japanese store. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess an important point to make on this episode is when we talk about multiple storefronts, we don't mean it has to be on the same platform. Now, obviously, as a global business, you want to have some consolidation of technology because there's more efficiency there, especially with things like global agreements and license fees and control and process. But there are times when people will tactically launch in a new market on a non-legacy system. I've seen people who've been on old Hybris installation, and they've rapidly launched with a third party off for Shopify because it's a far lower cost to market and quicker proof of concept. And then some might fold that into their existing technology later on once it's at the right level, or they might just do a technology shift globally onto a newer platform and bring it in there.
Yeah, I think we've had a few clients that have maybe been on like a Magento or WooCommerce, moved entirely to a Shopify, and then end up working with a third party to build like a Magento open source or very lean WooCommerce site with like a CDN and a bridge to optimize for China, because Shopify is still not particularly performant in China. So yeah, that's another interesting one that we've had quite a few clients do, and I feel like that's another one that's getting a lot of interest at the moment. I still don't think there's like a really obvious, like amazing solution for people trying to build like a local Chinese site. But yeah, it's another one that I've seen a lot recently.
Yeah, my final use case, and I know I'm not saying to everyone listening this is an exhaustive list, but the key use case I've seen for investing in multiple store views is where you have distributed teams internationally. So you have local country teams responsible for managing their local country trading online. They will have specific local language needs. you might have a core platform and core set of tools that don't have local language packs for their territory. They might have different third-party tool needs based on what's the specialist in that local market. I've seen that in places in Latin America. And the complexity of having a single store view, even where you have different language views, and then having everybody managing all of the merchandising rules, the product recommendation rules, trading, everything within that single interface, the concern of error creeping in or things being overwritten and not having that separation and control means that actually, as a global e-commerce organization, it makes sense to have that run as a separate storefront.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's reminded me of one other, which is arguably not best placed here, but and it's a slightly controversial one because I feel like everyone's got different opinions on it, but the role of a staging and test site in the SaaS world. And like, it's different to like a typical kind of staging environment in the sense that it's just a completely different store. You know, you're completely open to differences, etc. But that's another one where in an ideal world, you'd have a separate store and, you know, you'd have the same kind of deployment processes and it would use the same like repository and everything else. But yeah, that's another one that probably does need to be factored in here in the modern world and the way that kind of everyone's going.
Yeah, which is basically you don't have a traditional staging environment. You have your development environment, and then you have your production environment, and things are edited and managed, but in a preview mode before publish. Yeah. Okay, so let's flip back to where do we see sensible use cases for only needing a single storefront? So I'm going to give you my three key ones, and then interested to hear your perspective. So number one is if you're a very simple business model, you're operating a single brand from a single country, UK, France, wherever it might be. Good example would be a UK business with a UK registered business, and you've only got a single warehouse in the UK, and that sends out. And international sales is a very small percentage. So we're talking less than 10% of your total revenue. Unless you're planning an aggressive expansion, it doesn't seem to make sense to have different storefronts for those additional territories because the revenue benefit of it is quite low, and you're not going to have the team that's actively trading and meaningfully managing those storefronts for localization. That's number one, and that leads into not providing or only giving minimal localization for the front end customer experience. So, for example, we talked about before, a French visitor comes and they can toggle to, like, I select my French flag and it now shows me Euro pricing, and banners might have local language versions, but it's not a fully localized site with full translation, customized product catalog, customized navigation, etc. For very basic, just minimal localization. And the third one is where you just need to do basic geo-targeting of content based on an identifier like an IP with a CMS that enables you to make some simple content changes. So those are the ones where it feels like, you know what, you're boiling the ocean if you try and launch multiple storefronts. You can do it effectively until the international sales from specific territories can grow to a level where you think, do you know what, there's a proof of concept worth running here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I completely agree with all of those. And I think the point I was probably going to make was usually my suggestion is prove, like, so we're talking to a brand at the minute, they do a fair amount of revenue online, but they don't necessarily have any demand yet, and they definitely don't understand it. So I think my suggestion for them was, while they figure out what a strategy could look like and how much demand they potentially could have in other markets, introduce multiple currency, like multi-currency. If certain markets take off, introduce payment methods, etc. Like potentially test like a bit more marketing, then gradually introduce additional stores where you need it initially, and then potentially if you go down additional DCs, etc. And I think the other one is team. And I had one example actually where we have a client who's got 3 stores, makes complete sense. They have 2 warehouses, they're very international, like it's the leanest possible route for them. They've just acquired a new brand. It's an old brand, but they're re-releasing it. Trade will be relatively limited initially. And they wanted to have multiple stores, but I've argued that one store makes complete sense. Like it's going to be limited demand initially. They only really need, 3 currencies. Most of the revenue is going to come from the UK. There's a few minor things that they've had to compromise on around local payment methods. But overall, I think it's definitely the right move. And then the one thing I was going to add is, today it's so much easier to launch an additional store than it was 2 or 3 years ago. And I think the thing with them is, it'd be less than a week's work to introduce another store. So it makes sense to, focus all your very limited attention in that case on, that existing site, and potentially, trying to use the limited resource to better communicate with previous customers, or, start to invest a bit more time into marketing, etc. And then as you hire more people and have more of a need, you introduce additional stores.
Yeah, I think that you've made this point a few times about if the bulk of your revenue is in one single country, and the revenue from the additional store fronts you could add is minimal at that country level. And I've seen people where they've been talking about launching a site for France or Germany, and it's like 2% of sales. Unless you're number one territory. A lot, as you said, there was one with 75%. I've seen people where their main store has got 90% revenue. If that's got fundamental issues in that store that aren't fixed, so you're not in a program of conversion rate optimization where you're just incrementally improving, but you've fundamentally got issues, customer experience issues, conversion issues, product issues, whatever it might be, stock issues. You've got to fix that first, because that's your revenue protection. And once that model and that operating model and process is robust, it becomes such a more efficient process to roll out a second store, because you have those processes to replicate, even if you then have to tailor them slightly.
Yeah, I think we've got loads of clients that have done, particularly France and Germany, when it's well under 1% of their revenue. And I think the thing that people forget is, one, that the overhead and how much of a distraction it is for internal teams, but also how much effort it takes to do it properly. Because I think if you're localizing stores, you're servicing the same set of customers in the same way. They're, people that maybe already are interested in the brand, they come into the site, they're buying. There's very little difference in it being local language versus English language. Fine. But, if you're trying to prospect to new customers and you want it to be like a really good brand experience, you need to have people internally to build out content and trade the sites and really understand those local customers and the local markets. And then, customer service, CRM, like it all needs to be localized. Like if you localize the front end of the site, really you have to localize the whole thing. And I think people sometimes underestimate the amount of money and time that needs to go into it. They don't do it properly. And then the thing that we were obviously talking about before this episode, which I see as a big trend at the minute, is the reverse localization. So people getting rid of their Spanish site, potentially their French site. A lot of our clients do really well in Germany, so that's maybe a bit more of an area they're willing to invest in. But there's a lot of that at the moment, I think.
Yeah, agree. And also, coming back to the value of a single storefront, but with some elements of localization to give people better than nothing, is you can often incrementally add elements in and start to measure the impact. Do you start getting better conversion from those countries? Do you get more customers? Do you get better retention? So, you can use a CMS to publish, a different version of an asset depending on the locale selected, or by an IP. Modern CMSs enable you to do that. You can have a payment provider that covers all the international plus local payment methods, so likes of Adyen, Checkout.com, Stripe, etc., so that you ensure that in the checkout, the local payment methods the customer needs are enabled rather than just forcing them down a card payment. You can use international address validation tools like a Locate and have country selector pre-defaulted towards the person's location. So if someone's visiting France, it pre-defaults to the French country selector, and they can change it if they then want to ship or go to a different country. You can then even do things like that point you said about the customer service piece is critical, because the cost of doing it is expensive. But if you know that you're quite phone order dependent for e-commerce revenue, you could do a pilot with a local number with somebody, outsource it for a bit, where you provide a local customer service support and measure what impact that has before you create a fully localized site or an additional storefront. So I think there are smart configuration approaches you can take to a single storefront to gradually build up the confidence to launch a standalone store. What's your take on that?
No, I completely agree. That's what I personally recommend to a lot of our clients. Like, you get the basics in place, the currencies, the payment methods, the branded search and shopping exposure, etc. And then as you have the demand or the business reasons to launch into another territory, like invest in it. But yeah, same principle.
Yeah, I think it's about setting expectation, because there are certain markets where having an English language site goes down worse than others in Europe, like France. You just do not get the same level of response if you don't have a properly translated site. That's just a reality. Doesn't mean you can't generate or increase sales, but you will be limited in the ceiling you can achieve. So let's get on to our final topic, the decision tree. So what I wanted us to each take turns in talking through is, okay, so we talked about a lot about multiple single storefronts, the use cases, the decision criteria. Let's give people a kind of like series of questions or things they need to think about in order to help them make the decision. So if I go through my approach first, then you can pull it apart and laugh at and come up with your own one. But I normally start people thinking about, so we were talking about this before we started recording it, and the key point you made, I'm stealing your thunder, but about, is the cost of adding a storefront just justified? Or do the added costs involved? So this might be, if you're using a SaaS and you've got an app and you've got to pay extra app license fees for the additional store view, all the additional license fees of your core e-commerce platform. Does the cost versus benefit stack up? Then it's looking about, okay, if you're operating in multiple countries, do you have any specific legal or financial requirements where actually you really do need to have a separate storefront in order to connect to the relevant bank accounts, to handle compliance, whatever it might be, that you can't achieve in your current system with that single store view, or the cost of achieving it would be so expensive it's quicker to just roll up a second store? We've talked about whether your percentage of sales is really, really low, and can you really justify it? We talked about inventory management, so I always go through that piece about, how do you fulfill? Can you connect to the relevant stock files? Do we have problems in this? Same with like then go through the taxation piece and the pricing, and then it comes down to things like, do you have a very specific, unique brand identity that's different to your core site, and therefore you really need to sculpt something that's different and has unique user journeys. And that leads into B2C versus B2B, which is, are you selling to trade customers online? And do you have a proper B2B set of requirements that isn't just a question of change in price? So, for example, multi-level accounts, permission-based logins, payment on credit, custom price books, etc., where you're not going to get that out of a consumer site, and therefore you will need a B2B storefront in order to achieve that properly. So that's kind of some of the decision criteria I go through. What are your starting points with people? What are the most important questions they should be asking themselves?
Yeah, it is a really interesting one, because it does differ by business. I think the main one comes down to incremental value, like forgetting, the only thing I would say is there are some variables. Like we've got a client that has massive wholesale presence in like Asia, so they feel like they have to have local sites in those markets from a brand perspective, and they're the type of business that's got high AOV, long lead time, so they think there's like a discovery process that should be local. Like from my perspective, looking at the numbers, it doesn't make sense. But from their perspective, they believe, there's different stakeholders that do believe that does make sense. But from like purely standard e-com perspective, I think, usually it would be like, if you want to go out and prospect new customers, acquire a load of new customers, like truly grow into a market, and it's got a different language, that makes sense, usually, assuming that it does make sense. And then I think all the other ones you said, so like the DC piece, the warehouse piece, all of that is again like one of the most common ones. And then I think just team time, because that's another one. Like I said at the start, I just think there's so many people that are wasting time on maintaining local sites when all of the demand is branded. They're going to buy anyway. Because like we had one client where we removed the French and German sites. It was all people that were looking for their products. They'd only really buy via them. Everyone was a bit worried about it. I expected a drop in conversion rate and revenue, and there wasn't any really. And we just saw a big uplift in people using Google Translate. And then we also just found that people would buy anyway. So I think, it's easy to forget that. Maybe, like you say, France is one where I think local language does make quite a big difference. Some of the Asian markets, but a lot of the others, there's so many native English speakers or people that are buying a branded product and they're able to get their way through the checkout. But yeah, I think, to be honest, you covered most of the main one.
Yeah, I think that's some really interesting additional points. It really does vary, but I think it really pays for people just ask the question about why they're doing it, what they're trying to achieve, what does a separate storefront give them that they can't do through just having a slight element of localization within their existing one, or does the cost of localizing the existing one prohibit and actually it make more sense? It's similar cost to launching everyone. Why don't we just do that? Excellent. So that's been a whistle-stop tour of multi-storefronts for e-commerce, what they are, when you need them, when you don't. We'd love to hear your views as well. Like, do you agree, disagree? Are we talking bollocks? Happy to be challenged on it as always. Do reach out and let us know. We'd love to hear your experience and when you've seen the need for people or your business to move from a single to multiple storefronts and what benefit it's had. Thank you for listening. Keep an ear out for the next episode. We drop them every week. Would love to know any topics you'd like us to cover as well. And do subscribe and leave us a rating on Apple, Spotify or YouTube. Until next week. For more information on this topic, head over to replatform.fm for our audio podcasts. To discuss a project, or if you'd like to chat about any of the topics covered in this episode in more detail, please reach out to myself, James Gurd, or my co-host Paul Rogers via LinkedIn and Twitter. Thanks again for listening and keep your ears peeled for the next episode.